The freehold of Valyria and its empire were destroyed by the Doom, but the shattered peninsula remains. Strange tales are told of it today, and of the demons that haunt the smoking sea where the 14 flames once stood. In fact, the road that joins Volantis to Slaver's Bay has become known as the Demon Road, and it is best avoided by all sensible travelers. In A Song of Ice and Fire, dragons are amongst the most elegant and deadly creatures in existence. At the start of our story, all that is left of them are their skeletons and petrified eggs. The story that the Valyrians found the dragons within the 14 Flames, the volcanic system on the peninsula, is well known, but much evidence seems to suggest that dragons originated from the Far East, in the Shadowlands beyond Ashai. Daenerys in A Game of Thrones is under the impression that this is true. She had heard that the first dragons had come from the east, from the Shadowlands beyond Ashai and the islands of the Jade Sea. Perhaps some were still living there, in realms strange and wild. In the annals of Ashai, it is said that for certain, the first dragons came from the Shadow, a place where all of our learning fails us. These Ashai histories say that people so ancient that they had no name first tamed the dragons in the Shadow and brought them to Valyria, teaching the Valyrians their arts before departing from the annals. George R. Martin confirmed in a fan correspondence from December 11th, 1999, that at some point in history, dragons had been all over the world. This disproves the Valyrian claims that the first dragons were theirs in the 14 Flames. We know that at least at one point in history, dragons roamed the globe freely. According to the World of Ice and Fire, dragons have also been found in Ib and the jungles of Sothoros, their skulls at least, and it is also mentioned in the World of Ice and Fire that the Yellow Emperor of Yi Ti kept a dragon in his court. Though it seems that the Valyrians were not the first to find nor keep dragons, they utilized them in ways that no others had before, turning them into weapons of mass destruction. Dragons are inherently magical beings. It is said that they are fire-made flesh. Their lives are many times that of a man. As they age, their scales grow thicker, and their dragon flame grows hotter. Balerion the Black Dread could melt stone and steel with his black fire. Dragons are near invulnerable to fire, but not completely. There are cases of dragons being hurt and even blinded by the flame of other dragons. There is no doubt that there is some special connection between the Valyrian nobility and their dragons. This connection, however, doesn't seem to be as solid as the connection between a warg and a wolf. The implications are that the taming of dragons must in some way relate to a magical bonding, a bond that is able to be passed down genetically. The phrase, blood of the dragon, seems to add weight to this. All Valyrian magic was said to be rooted in fire and blood, so we can only assume that it was some sort of blood ritual that created the bond that linked the dragons and the Valyrians initially. Knowledge of how to perform such a thing would obviously have had to come from the people of the Shadow, who, for whatever reason, must have taught the Valyrians how to bond themselves with dragons, as well as various other arts, including their technique of fusing stone and even possibly the production of Valyrian steel. It seems evident that dragons have some sort of effect on the potency of magic in the A Song of Ice and Fire world. There is evidence that the proximity affects the potency. It is easy to assume that the number of dragons would also have some effect. This all being said, magic performed within the Valyrian Empire must have been quite powerful due to the amount of dragons. This would explain better why the Valyrians were able to conquer the East so quickly. They not only had dragon fire, but powerful sorcery as well. Not much is known about life within Valyria, but we do know that only noble houses had dragons. It would likely then follow that magical learning was confined amongst the highborn. The Targaryens, however, seem to not have kept any of the magical teachings of the Lost Empire. Strange, considering the fact that Dragonstone was built using the Valyrian way of fusing stone, now lost. The Targaryens obviously knew at least some methods. They hatched dragon eggs on Dragonstone as well. But why did they not maintain the knowledge? Why has knowledge that kept an empire for millennia faded from memory after only a few hundred years? Perhaps the spells no longer worked. Perhaps much of the ancient Valyrian magic only worked while the empire stood. The castle Dragonstone was built while the Valyrian Empire still stood. It was 100 years after Daenerys Targaryen's prophecy that the doom of Valyria came down. There was no evidence of any Valyrian fused stone structures being built after this point. It makes more sense that the knowledge could have been lost if the techniques no longer worked. If dragons are the sources of magic in A Song of Ice and Fire, then much of that power must have been lost when the vast majority of dragons died in the Doom. But still, the Targaryens at least had some dragons. But perhaps this was not enough, and also blood was required. It is known that the Valyrians would sacrifice slaves to work their sorcery. Slaves were treated horribly in the Valyrian Empire. It is mentioned that the Targaryens brought slaves when they initially came to Westeros, but obviously the practice stopped. Slavery at the time had been forbidden in Westeros for thousands of years, since the rise of the Faith of the Seven. Valyrian the Dread, though adult at this time, wouldn't have been the legend that he would be 100 years later. So perhaps Targaryens, less temperamental than Aegon, decided to conform rather than anger the other inhabitants of Westeros. Without the blood of slaves, the Targaryens would not be able to use the Valyrian sorcery they knew, however much they knew. With Valyria destroyed, and whatever magical learning the Targaryens possessed now useless, the last of the Valyrian spells faded from history. We could only hope that there would remain some traces at Dragonstone. Also, with proximity considered, I suspect that the reason in modern times that Asshai is the main hub of magic is because dragons have always lived somewhere in the Far East, deep within the Shadowlands. This is also suggested in Book 1 when Bran sees dragons stirring in the east. He lifted his eyes and saw clear across the narrow sea, to the free cities and the green Dothraki Sea and beyond, to Vaes Dothrak under its mountains, to the fabled lands of the Jade Sea, to Asshai by the Shadow, where dragons stirred beneath the sunrise. The current state of Valyria greatly suggests that the Doom had a supernatural cause. Anyone who travels to Valyria does not return, with the possible exception of Euron Greyjoy. After the Doom, Aerion, one of the only surviving dragon lords, rode atop his dragon with a host of 30,000 men back to Valyria to reclaim the freehold as its king. They were never seen again. The sky is always red above Valyria, Hugor Hill. Are we close? Closer than the crew would like. Do you know the stories in your Sunset Kingdom? I know some sailors say that any man who lays eyes upon that coast is doomed. Valyria seems to be a cursed place, damned for some reason. One cannot help but get the sense that the Valyrians were punished by some force, perhaps for their cruelty and their own pride, or for reasons we could not comprehend. Perhaps they misused the gifts that the Shadow People gave them, and those entities retaliated by destroying them. Perhaps it was the slaves within the mines revolting and triggering the eruption of the volcano through practical or magical means. Or perhaps it was the Dragon Lords themselves. Many noble families contested for power in Valyria. Each of them had dragons and employed wizards. It is said that blood mages mated slave women and animals and brought forth half-human monsters. Perhaps through their own squabbles and dabbling in powerful magics, they destroyed themselves. And after they were gone, magic, at least in the West, began its slow dying. Westeros. The first raven is said to have been let into the world when the crone peered through the door of death. In the real world, ravens are often associated with prophecy. In ancient Greece, they were the messengers of the god Apollo, the god of truth and prophecy. In Celtic legends, the bird